Okay, so hopefully we can all see that. Please shout out in the chat if you can't. So good morning. The focus of the session today, as Mark said, we're going to go into some more of the kind of the real world, as he said, war stories. So what I'm going to start with today is talking about how we can prepare and really focusing on some practical tips and hints about how we can get ready for what is, let's face it, the inevitable. Just before I get into that, let's just do a quick intro of kind of who CSI is as a business. We're a managed service provider. I don't know if Andy Dunn has joined us on the call. If Andy's there, please shout, because Andy is also representing us at CSI today and is going to join me on the presentation. Oh, okay, Andy's delayed, so I'll carry on. So we're a managed services provider. I'll go into a little bit of focus about the specific areas around major incident, but today is mostly about the hints and tips. So won't spend too much time on this, but we are really focused on helping organizations to deliver their technology needs through recurring services, but also through advisory services. We're a global organization. As you can see on the map, we've got presence in the US and Europe and across the world. So we've been around for 40 years. It's actually our 40th anniversary year this year, so big parties at CSA Towers this year. We offer a range of services across the spectrum of 24/7 support, through to cybersecurity. Obviously, we run a SOC service, so very embedded in that, and also lots of focus on protecting data, and particularly in organisations that have got highly regulated environments and specific requirements. So that's our kind of sweet spot. In terms of this slide, if Andy's joined us,
I'm on, Kevin.
Perfect timing, Andy.
Yeah, sorry everyone. I logged on to Zoom and it decided I was a couple of versions behind where you guys needed me to be, so it's done an impromptu upgrade. So, and sincere apologies for my late attendance. Yeah, so Kevin's covered off. We have this revenue split where we've made this transition from being historically a reseller of technology into the managed service provider, and those revenues you saw previously of kind of where we've tipped the balance in favor of revenues that are recurring rather than one-off, which is where kind of where every transitioning MSP wants to get to, and those revenues are in double-digit growth year on year currently. So that is testimony really to the level of involvement that we have in those regulated businesses, those high-end managed services that we provide. And as a result of that, the security profile is often slightly different to your not run rate, that's not fair, your mainstream service providers for Azure and AWS and Google and private cloud, etc. So we have a heightened awareness around security because of the nature of the services that we provide. So the primary focus of the business is enabling modernization of the applications environment on which those applications sit, right? So typically that is done in regulated environments. That's where our real value proposition kicks in. But as a result of that, we do a lot of work alongside universities and life sciences businesses attached to university development, and in the financial sector, as you can imagine, being regulated. So the PRA and the FCA, etc., have a lot of input onto the type of security and protection services that we provide. As you can see from this, we have a large orientation in our history to IBM Power, which again plays into the complex environment world. So the Power Cloud that we provide is mirrored only by IBM and their Power Cloud globally. So we have that global presence to deliver high-end, high-performance, highly available configurations globally, and still meet global regulation to enable customers' environments in a highly secure, highly available way. And we have two sets of customers: those that want to stay in that environment and adopt a public cloud element in parallel, and we have those that are looking to get off that legacy world and into new world, so SaaS offerings and consumption on demand, etc. So those are the two types of workloads that we deal with, and we are trying to look at developing new markets in line with the world of containerization under OpenShift, and what that means for customers going forward in terms of ad hoc consumption, CI/CD, the security wrap around, the dynamic replacement of the underlying architecture to optimize from a cost to performance perspective. And we're highly aligned to Azure currently with our Amazon partnership emerging. And of course, we tap into the IBM cloud for that world as well. And then both of those environments need to be underpinned with protection services. So the third tower that we concentrate on as a business is how do we keep our security and protection services aligned to both the regulator and customer demand. I'm going to come back to that at the end in terms of the alignment that we have in terms of the story and the proposition there. And then all of that is kind of pulled together by our relationship with ISVs and software as a service organizations, because we often provide platforms specifically for the delivery of a specific application or SaaS type offering, be it in financial services, manufacturing, logistics. We adopt a number of ISV relationships and specifically deliver those applications via specific environments to specific customers. So it's quite narrow swim lane, and as a result we have lots of accreditations because we touch multiple organizations with that high-end compute environment. So it tends to be led by IBM and increasingly Red Hat coming to the fold. Obviously our public cloud arrangement is predominantly with Microsoft. We have a very strict growth initiative with Microsoft, which we're in our second year of and we're on track with. So the adoption of Microsoft within our business has been significant. I think we've trebled our Microsoft consumption over the last 2 years. Strong alignment with Dell, newly emerging relationship with Veeam, and as a result, you would imagine us to be on a number of the frameworks and have the right ISO accreditations to underpin everything that we do. Where we're not on every framework, we have a thin priming relationship with somebody who is on all the frameworks. So there's not a lot we can't cover. Moving on, Kev.
Thank you, Andy. So moving into kind of the preparing for major incident scenarios, I'm going to take you through a number of different focus areas on this, and just, as I said, give some practical hints and tips to think about to hopefully underpin what we're going to talk about later today. So, starting with really the basics, making sure that we've got the right things in place before we even get to a major incident scenario, which, let's face it, is inevitable. So first of all, preaching to the choir here, but process. So, do we have the right process? Is it documented? There's of course plenty of best practice guidance out there, but really, as we all know, it's got to fit our organization, it's got to fit our business and the users that we're serving. So we've got to take that into account. We've also got to think about any regulatory requirements that we may have to satisfy when documenting the process. So it's important to think about that. So make sure the process is documented. I think the other crucial step here as well is to make sure that the process is clear. It's all well and good having a magnum opus of dozens and dozens of diagrams and steps and pages, but at 2 in the morning when something goes down and somebody wants to declare a major incident, that's great, but it's not going to help. So make sure we've got the appropriate level of documentation for the right audience so that we can actually execute the major incident and follow the steps we need to make sure we do what we've planned for. So having that kind of documented and easy to use is the first step. Then, of course, we've got to make sure that everybody understands that. So people, as always in process and in everything, people are key. So making sure that everybody is armed with the process. We've trained them in advance. We've got the appropriate guidance documents available to them, so they understand the role that they play in the process. And that equally applies to users as well as those of us that are actually executing the technical or the communication or process steps of the process. So making sure that people are armed. Those that need to execute the process need to know where to get the documentation. So it's all well and good having something stuck in a DMS or a Confluence or something somewhere, but if they don't know how to get to it, then they'll be winging it. So let's make sure that they understand where the processes and the supporting materials are. We also need to make sure we keep that current, especially if we're in an environment, hopefully, that it could be, I've not worked in one yet, but if we've got a low frequency of major incidents or a low frequency of incidents in general, then it might not be every day we're dealing with these things, and hopefully it isn't. So making sure we keep that knowledge current with our people as well is key. Obviously it comes after process and people, but tooling. So Yeah, make sure that the processes you're designing are aligned with your ITSM platform of choice, whether that's ServiceNow, BSM Remedy, or something else. Make sure that what you're documenting in the process can actually be executed in the tool. There's often a mismatch between screens and kind of fields even that you're prescribing in a process that need to be followed, that when it comes to execution you can't, because you've upgraded the system, you've moved platforms even, and you haven't kind of brought that along. So making sure you've got alignment between your ITSM platform and your process will just reduce confusion and reduce the time to actually execute the major incident process, because that timing, especially in cyber scenarios, can be absolutely critical. So make sure they match. Also, it's important to make sure that within the ITSM platform, you actually have a way of triggering or flagging a major incident, and hopefully being able to treat that as a discrete item within the system. So you can measure, you can understand, and when you come to CSI later, you can understand how you executed the major incident. So having a way to actually flag that in the system. It could be simple, could just be a tick box that you have, or it could be a full-blown major incident process flow within your ServiceNow, for example. So understanding that you've got that in place. Also, just moving on to kind of continual improvement. So having all of that in place is great, but it's never going to be static. And there's always going to be opportunities to learn from a major incident we've been through, opportunities to bring things into a process. Perhaps we've launched a new service that has got an entirely different user community. We need to consider how we will communicate with them during a major incident scenario. So the process is always evolving. For me, the best way to make sure that we don't just pay lip service to continuous improvement, but we actually deliver it, is to embed the continuous improvement mechanisms and the things we're going to do in the process when we design it. So design it up front to make it part of the execution of the major incident. So making sure you've got post-incident reviews as a concrete step, and that you build up the material to deliver that through the major incident, rather than racing to the end and then trying to figure out how you learn from what happened. So that's the kind of the first part, is getting the basics in place. Then moving on to monitoring and identifying major incidents themselves. So there's a few things to think about here. The first is kind of, what are you going to monitor? So, are you flying blind, or have you got kind of the elements of your estate feeding into your event management systems, your alerting platforms, and then into your ITSM tool? You may not be there on day one, you may not be there on day 365, but starting somewhere on that journey in terms of identifying what it is that you need to monitor. So if essentially, what do you care about if it goes down? So if a server somewhere is supporting a critical application, have you got that identified? Is it monitored in your platform, and can you receive an alert from it? And when you receive that alert, what's the system going to do with it? So having that kind of the what up front is the first key step. And then it's kind of, how are you going to do that? So, you could have multiple discrete event management systems or alerting platforms, so SolarWinds, Nagios, etc. You could have people with eyes on that. They could be manually rekeying into a service management platform, or you could adopt something like ServiceNow with the IT operations management suite, where you could integrate those alerts and do some level of correlation, so that you get some of the noise reduced. So thinking about how you're going to actually monitor. So hopefully this isn't the case, but sometimes you put some monitoring in and you expect somebody's going to spot it and somebody will deal with it. But I think for those of us who've been in an operations center at 2 a.m. staring at a sea of red alerts, it can be a little bit more tricky than that. So understanding exactly how you're going to do that is key. And also, again, understanding within that set of alerts, what are the key ones? Which ones should be a P1? Which ones should raise a critical event? So understanding how going to do that. And then that really leads on to kind of seeing the wood for the trees. So understanding the meaning of all of those alerts that are coming in, and what actually is a major incident scenario. So it kind of comes on to one of the holy grails of IT service management, but service mapping. I'm sure we're all at different stages of that in our organizations, but it really is key to understand the services that we're delivering to our users, understanding the components within those services, how they relate ideally as well, but just understanding what's in there to begin with is a great start. And then making a decision about how we're going to treat those alerts in systems and then in process. So that could start as simply as just tagging a server to say this server is a component of our learning management platform. So if this server raises a critical alert, jump on it, do the troubleshooting, and potentially raise a major incident. You can start there. You can end up with full-blown service maps and a more sophisticated CMDB and CMDB and configuration management system. But making sure you understand that kind of what makes up the components of the crown jewels is a key part. And then, as with the process element, it's never static. So thinking about change when it comes to monitoring is absolutely critical. I've been there in previous roles where something's been decommissioned, we didn't decommission it properly in the system, or something has been brought into service and we didn't follow the transition process properly. And then lo and behold, we've got a major incident that we didn't know about because an alert wasn't coming into the system. So making sure that you understand when you are making changes, whether that's through the change management process, whether it's through demand management and kind of capacity management, which obviously should come through the change management process eventually anyway, but making sure all of that considers the monitoring and all of the elements within the monitoring, both in and decommissioning as well. So that's the kind of understanding what the environment is. Then just moving on to probably the most crucial part of major incident management, communication. So it's all well and good as having the best processes and executing effectively, but if we don't then communicate what we're doing, we're just going to be inundated with users asking us what we're doing and assuming we're not doing it. But also, we're going to have confusion in the environment. So communication is absolutely key. So the first thing to think about is who we're going to communicate with. And this ideally builds on the service mapping from the monitoring side of things. So if we put the thought in up front in terms of what our services are, who the user communities of our services are, then we can understand who we need to communicate with for those particular services. So we don't have to communicate to everybody if it's only users of a particular platform. So LMS again as an example, that need to know about the major incident. We can introduce major incident fatigue if we over communicate on every single incident if it doesn't potentially impact the user. But understanding that is a kind of key first part. We also need to understand who might receive queries from users or from other parties, whether it's regulators or whether it's the media. So understanding who might actually be called. We'd love it if it was everybody phoning the service desk to get all their updates, but I think we know that's probably not going to happen, and people will shortcut and people will escalate and ask questions. So it's important to understand who may get those questions so that we can ensure they're on the stakeholder list, we can communicate with them and give them the appropriate information so that they can do onward communications. Then it's important to think about kind of how we're going to communicate. So do the work up front in terms of what are your channels of communication, and it probably isn't the same channel for every audience. So who is it appropriate to send an SMS to? Who would want to have a more detailed notification? Thinking about the type of audience you're communicating to as well, which I'll come on to in a second. But do the work up front to define how you're going to communicate through what channels, and make that part of the execution of the plan, rather than sitting there when the incident's going on and trying to brainstorm, okay, who might be impacted? How should we communicate with them? We don't have a template, let's write an email. So if you do all of that kind of work up front, define your templates, set up your SMS system if that's your system of choice, and get the users populated in there and tagged to services if you've got to that level, so that you're not focusing on that during the actual eye of the storm. You're just executing. So how are you going to do that? And then also in that is kind of deciding up front the frequency of the messaging and then sticking to it. So again, if we could be doing the best work in the back end that we possibly can, but if we're not sticking to some kind of frequent communication cadence with our users or with regulators or whoever else it may be, then we're just inviting questions and inviting noise back to us. So think about that up front and get that documented in the work instructions and the standard operating procedures. And then thinking about exactly what we're going to communicate, and importantly as well, what we're not going to communicate. This also comes back to the audiences. So we don't necessarily want to confuse or overwhelm end users with deep techie talk or technical information about a service, but we don't want to go necessarily with a super high level update to a technical audience. So again, once we've understood who and how, then we tailor the comms to make sure we're giving the right message to the right people. That could also include onward suppliers and third parties. So if you're part of a chain within a service, so you're maybe delivering a platform and then somebody else is delivering a service after that platform, then you need to make sure you're communicating not just with your users and your internal stakeholders, but that you've got channels established to communicate and collaborate with other third parties that you're providing service to or you are receiving service from. So having that kind of thinking again up front is key. The final part on communication is, especially when it comes to kind of cyber major incidents, which I'll come on to further in a second, is the appropriateness of who you communicate with in terms of external parties. So make sure that you engage with the right people within your own organization when it comes to thinking about the messaging you're going to present externally. And any questions you may receive or anybody within your organization may receive from the media, from regulators, or from anybody with a Twitter account these days. So ensuring that everybody understands, where the line is about what you will say, what you won't say, what you can or what you can't say, and get that guidance from your internal comms team or whoever it is that manages that within your organization up front, so that everybody understands. And that this is going to be continual education, because that is a very difficult thing to manage. So consider that up front in the process and plan for the types of major incidents and the scenarios that you're going to have to think about that, and potentially engage those media relations people to come in and work as part of your major incident team, especially when it comes to cyber incidents. A little bit on risk before I move on to cyber. So in terms of business continuity planning, the first place to start is risk treatment. So understanding your risks. What are the risks that could impact your organization? Which ones do you need to have a plan for? Which ones don't you need to have a plan for? Or is there a time-bound element to that? So, you could have a platform where you can live with it for a couple of days without it being available. But if it got to 4 or 5 days, so, potentially there's a deadline coming up where students have got to receive notifications. You could go to a manual system as a plan. So you could have a plan for that. But there could come a point where actually this is no longer sustainable. So we need to have a business continuity plan for that. So do that thinking up front in terms of what you need to have a risk treatment plan for, and then what that plan is going to be. Then kind of how are you going to execute that? So what is the strategy? And this is where the scenario planning really comes in. So, work through your scenarios in terms of how you will deal with the risks that you've chosen to treat. How are you actually going to treat those? So again, I'll take an example of a learning management platform, or Blackboard, for example. If that's going to be down for a sustained period of time, what is your plan? How are you going to execute that? Are you going to move to fully Zoom lectures? Are you going to have staff using presentations and sending those out by email? And how are they going to do that? How do they get access to the students' information? Plan that up front and kind of have that strategy in terms of how are you going to actually execute, and equally what you're not going to do. So be clear in your business continuity plan where the line is between enough service to continue running your business versus trying to get everything working exactly as it was when you weren't in a business continuity scenario. And then obviously planning, and this really is test. So again, if you're hopefully in an environment where you're not initiating business continuity very often, it's equally more important, or even more important I should say, to make sure that you test regularly, that you train people in terms of how to execute the process and the business continuity plans, and that you keep learning from that, the same way we spoke about the process earlier. Final section for me before I hand back to Andy to close. What's different when it comes to a major incident scenario, sorry, a cyber major incident scenario? So I think the first point is it's major incident management 101. So everything we've spoken about previously applies to cyber major incidents. Make sure that we've got all of those kind of processes in place, the monitoring, the risk management, all of that needs to be in place. But you're going to have specific guidance when it comes to types of cyber incidents that you need to deal with. So having SOPs or work instructions that deal with how to deal with a ransomware attack, or somebody Office 365 logging in somewhere. How are you going to deal with that? Plan for those in advance and document those as part of work instructions and SOPs. And do you have the right technical solution in place? So it's all well and good receiving an alert that says somebody's logged in one country in 1 minute and another country 2 minutes later. But if you don't have a system or a process in place to actually remediate that risk, then you might as well not know about it. So, that could be you setting up an organization that deals with that and remediates security threats, or it could be partnering somebody that can deliver a 24/7 security service that can remediate threats. So think about how you actually will architect that. Risk we spoke about, so make sure that the VCP plan is in place. Make sure that you're within your risk planning, you're focusing on specific cyber threats to your business. So what are the crown jewels? What are the systems that hackers are going to be targeting, and how are you going to protect those? And it's inevitable, there will be a cyber attack on these systems. How will you deal with it when it happens? So making sure you have that in place. And this is where legacy comes in. So, I've been in organizations where we've had Windows 3.11 still running. There's going to be legacy in the estate. How do you deal with those kind of things? What's your patching policy? What's your retirement policy? Understanding is the first part, and then working on the treatment plan. DEFCON 1. So there are going to be major incident scenarios where all bets are off. And let's take an example of Office 365 or G Suite. We live in it these days. If those platforms are compromised, or your access to those platforms are compromised, have you done the thinking up front for how you are going to run the major incident, run the senior stakeholder comms, and then actually continue the business without access to email, without access to Teams, without access to Slack? So, one way of doing that is to have kind of an air-gapped process that you train senior people on offline. So it could be as simple as having a telephone communication conferencing system as a backup. You could have, Google accounts to give to senior people. This could be the board that can't operate the business. So having, secure email accounts, having backup phone numbers, having that process trained and understood could save you in those kind of scenarios, and I've seen it happen. So having that in place and doing that thought process up front to plan for the absolute worst case scenario would be a really useful exercise. And it's no good doing that without training people. So making sure they understand, because at the end of the day, people are where it all could stand up, or could be in tatters on the floor. We can be as prepared as we want for a major incident, but somebody is going to click a link, somebody's going to do something they shouldn't do. So we need to be preparing our users as best we can on a continual basis for that. And in this day and age where the line between work and home is really blurred, we can use that to our advantage. We can give people skills to help them at home securing their personal accounts through MFA, that then transfers to the workplace where they are more security aware and help us within the day-to-day environment. So making sure our users, our first line of defense, are continually educated, and making sure they understand how to execute the major incident process fundamentally. So how do they raise the flag if something goes wrong, and who do they go to? So those are the tips. I'm just going to hand over to Andy just to build on that as well.
Brilliant, thanks, Kevin. Yeah, so the user profiling has been an interesting point. Obviously, COVID has made us all learn a different way of securing users, in that, when you were in one building, you had one location with 500 people in it, so you only had to secure the location, and now you've got 500 different locations with 500 different broadbands and God knows what else accessing that route in, right? So the profile changed. So what we found was this need to establish, a credible story to build the security offerings around, right? So whether you adopt NIST or Cyber Essentials, or in this particular case, the NCSC, the story is the same. You've all got to cover the same elements that you need to ensure that you're doing all that you can to prevent an incident in the first place. And obviously, with the new DORA accreditation making its way in, from an operational resilience or organizational resilience perspective, that's going to change. Those standards are going to change again. So what we try and do is maintain a level of our own security, as well as the security services that we offer, to meet any changes in that regulatory compliance, and then map onto any directives that you set as objectives and outcomes that you want as a business, be that Cyber Essentials, whether you're optimizing to meet a particular set of insurance premiums, which are pretty volatile right now based on the number of incidents, and insurers are being quite strict on the levels you need to go to ensure that you're doing all you can to avoid an incident. And those demands are going to continue to vary, right? So the offerings that organizations like ourselves will develop will continue to be aligned to that. So the idea is that everything we do is a continuous assessment and mapping onto, you know, the new demands, new changes, and that we deploy and update that in very much a kind of CI/CD approach to the continuous management of security resilience. And learning from the outbreaks as well is also a critical factor. So next slide, please. Okay. So the long and short of that is that we split into two worlds: cyber resilience and the data protection element. So now, whether that's a single server, a single user, or multiple cloud, multiple platforms, it doesn't matter. The offerings that all quality MSPs should provide should cover every eventuality and any shift that you have in those platforms as well. So this is a flavour of the partners that we have to cover specific aspects of the security offering, but they come together onto one SOC scene type environment that we deliver on our customers' behalf. And we also work with a number of these partners on outbreak management as well. So in particular, Veeam, for example, have just brought their new SIEM and outbreak management team to the table. So that's a really pertinent offering for where people find themselves. So it's a really nice bolt-on to the backup services. Now, whether that's the Office 365 backup or the core enterprise backup, there's another level of security coming from the backup providers. So that the line between backup and security is kind of blurring, and it's all merging into one. And we're referring to it, as you saw at the beginning, as our protects offering, where data protection and security kind of blend into one strategy, one swim lane in the business. And that's us really. I think we're on time, maybe a couple of minutes over, but if there's any questions, fire away. But hopefully that's given you some insight.